Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we really get into the heart of the material you've sent over your articles, your research, all those notes.
Exactly. We sift through it all.
And today, we're diving into something that, honestly, it offers a pretty different way of looking at just about everything. Systems thinking.
It really shifts your perspective.
Yeah, forget just breaking things down into tiny bits. Our mission here is to pull out the key insights from your sources, the surprising stuff, the patterns, the connections that maybe weren't obvious before.
It's all about those relationships, the interactions between the parts.
Right. And your material, it covers a lot, from our own inner worlds, our psychology, all the way out to big societal things. We're going to try and connect those dots for you.
And hopefully uncover some of those aha moments the sources point towards. It moves you past seeing things just in isolation.
So let's start with the basics then.
Yeah.
According to your sources, where did this whole way of thinking actually come from?
Well, the core idea, like you said, is that shift in focus. Away from just the components onto the relationships, the patterns,
Right.
and your sources, they trace it back to biologists, European biologists in the 1920s.
Really? Biology?
Yeah, it seems they were studying things like cells, but they kind of hit a roadblock. Just knowing the physics, the chemistry of the individual cells, well, it wasn't enough.
It didn't explain the whole living thing.
Exactly. They couldn't explain how these parts came together to make a complex organism just by looking at the parts alone. The whole system, the organism, was doing something, well, something more.
The classic, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Precisely that. But it's not magic, right? It's about what emerges from the interactions. You couldn't predict the organism's behavior just by studying a cell in a dish outside its context.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense for like a body
Yeah.
or an ecosystem.
Right. And it didn't just stay in biology. Your sources show how it spread out. It fueled fields like ecology, studying how organisms relate to their environment. And cybernetics, too, which is all about how systems regulate themselves, how they maintain stability. Concepts like feedback loops, homeostasis, keeping things in balance.
Which is kind of the opposite of the usual way we think, isn't it? Just breaking things down smaller and smaller.
Oh, it is. That's the more traditional reductionistic approach. Sometimes breaking things down helps, but sometimes you lose the picture of the whole system, the very thing you're trying to understand. This systems view focuses more on the network, the patterns.
And the sources mentioned actually mapping these things out, like that having your parts exercise.
Yeah, that's a practical application. A way to visually grasp the system, the connections, instead of just listing the bits.
Okay, this is where I think it gets really fascinating. How does this apply beyond biology or tech? How does it apply to us? Our own minds, our experiences.
Yeah, this is a huge leap your sources describe. It talks about how the author started using systems thinking in therapy. And a big insight was that traditional approaches, like standard psychiatric diagnoses, often felt, well, limited. Because they often focused just on the individual, maybe giving them a label, but they didn't always look enough at the context.
The situation they were in.
Exactly. Both the external systems, family, work, society, and, this is key, the system inside the person, their own internal world.
A system within us. What does that look like? Could you give an example from the sources?
Sure. There's a really powerful example in your material about a client dealing with bulimia.
Okay.
Instead of just seeing binging or restricting as the problem, the source saw this recurring pattern, a predictable cycle of interactions between different parts of her inner experience.
Parts, like different feelings or voices.
Kind of, yeah. The source calls them parts. So maybe there's a really harsh inner critic part. That critic says something awful, and it triggers another part that feels totally worthless, alone, maybe empty.
Right, that painful feeling.
Then to cope with that feeling, maybe another part jumps in, like a rescuer trying to numb the pain, perhaps through a binge.
Ah, I see the cycle starting.
Exactly, because then the critic comes back, maybe even harsher now, attacking her for the binge, which of course just triggers that worthless feeling all over again, and the cycle repeats.
Wow. So it wasn't just the critic or the binge itself, but the interaction, the loop they were stuck in.
That's the key insight. Seeing it as the self-reinforcing pattern between these inner parts suddenly made sense of behavior that seemed chaotic otherwise. And this leads to a huge point in your sources. Context. is everything.
Right.
Symptoms, whether they're emotional or behavioral, are often just signals. They're pointing to problems in the structure, the relationship patterns within these systems inside us and around us.
Like the family therapy example you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. The source notes how family therapists found that just focusing on the child's problem behavior often didn't work long term. But addressing the whole family system, the unspoken rules, the underlying beliefs, like maybe a family belief that any conflict is dangerous, or they have to look perfect to the outside world, that was transformative. It changed the system the symptom was living in.
Okay, so this system's perspective suggests our thoughts, feelings, urges. They aren't just isolated things floating around. They're like interconnected parts in our own internal system. And that system is also constantly interacting with the bigger systems we're part of, like family or society.
You've got it. That's the core idea. And then your sources zoom out even further. They apply this same thinking to really big societal systems.
How does that work?
Well, it looks at the most powerful beliefs in a society, especially beliefs about human nature. Are people basically good or basically bad, competitive or cooperative?
Okay.
Often, these are completely unstated assumptions. They're like the water fish swim in invisible paradigms that just govern the rules, the goals, how everything operates. The sources give examples like growth is always good, or the idea that you can own land in a certain way. These might seem totally normal to us, but really strange from a different cultural viewpoint.
And these underlying beliefs, these paradigms about human nature, they actually shape things.
Massively. Your sources bring up the placebo effect, how believing something helps can actually make it help. But then they talk about the flip side, the nocebo effect.
Right, where negative belief causes harm.
Exactly. And the argument in your sources is that negative, pessimistic beliefs about human nature act like a giant societal nocebo. They become self-fulfilling. If you expect the worst from people, you design systems based on control and punishment, which then elicits worse behavior, confirming your original negative belief. It creates these really vicious, reinforcing feedback loops.
And the source connects this directly to things like racism.
It does, quite starkly. It discusses something called the veneer theory.
Veneer theory.
Yeah, it's this pessimistic Western philosophical idea that civilization is just this thin coating, this veneer, over our supposedly primitive, aggressive, selfish core instincts. And your sources state that this view was historically used to justify differentiating people, basically racism, arguing that some groups were, less civilized, less able to control these bad inner parts. And crucially, the source suggests this external judgment often mirrors an internal one. It says, if we live in fear of parts of us, we will do the same to people who resemble those parts. We push away parts of ourselves we don't like, and then we push away people who remind us of those parts.
That's heavy stuff. But the source doesn't just leave it there, right? It challenges that view.
Oh, absolutely. It brings in the work of Rutger Bregman, whose research, cited in your material, argues the opposite, that humans are fundamentally oriented towards goodness and cooperation.
Okay, so an alternative view.
Yes, and Bregman, according to your source, goes back and critiques a lot of those famous psychological studies that supposedly proved the pessimistic view, finding, well, the source uses terms like rampant distortion and cherry-picking of data to fit the negative story.
So there's a whole other paradigm possible.
Okay.
Based on inherent goodness.
Exactly. And the source argues quite powerfully that if we actually operated from that paradigm, truly believing in basic human goodness, it could radically change our institutions. Think about it. If you start from that assumption, how would you design economic systems, schools, even prisons? Your sources draw a really sharp contrast here, looking at the U.S. versus the Norwegian prison systems.
Okay, what's the contrast?
Well, the source describes the U.S. system often characterized by high incarceration, racial disparities, focus on control, containment. Then it looks at Norway, which apparently has much lower reoffending rates. Their system, according to the source, operates differently. Guards are trained more like social workers, building relationships, helping inmates prepare for life outside, seeing them as future neighbors. It's based on a different view of the people involved.
A fundamentally different starting assumption.
Right. And the source asks this really profound question that gets under it all. What if there were no bad parts, only burdened ones? What if everyone was a self? A core of goodness.
That completely changes how you'd approach problems, whether inside yourself or out in the world.
It really does. The source argues that trying to fix things by going to war against them, whether it's social issues or parts of ourselves we don't like based on that negative veneer theory view, it just creates these escalating fights, reinforcing loops that drain energy and resources and can actually harm the very system you're trying to help.
Like the war on drugs example it mentions.
Exactly. The source calls it an unmitigated disaster, arguing we should have been listening to the message the drug problem was sending about pain or disconnection in the system rather than just trying to eradicate the symptom. Warring against nature or against parts of ourselves, it suggests, is counterproductive.
And this whole negative view, this sort of war mentality, the source links it to what it calls the story of separation.
Yes, this feeling of being fundamentally disconnected, cut off from others, and often, sadly, feeling disdain or shame about parts of ourselves. If you operate from the assumption that everyone's out for themselves, you feel you have to be too. Always guarded.
Which doesn't actually lead to feeling safe.
Right. The source argues it just breeds loneliness, shame, fear, and then we often hide those feelings, which just deepens the isolation. It's another painful loop.
Okay, you've mentioned feedback loops a few times. Let's dig into those a bit more. You talk about reinforcing loops, the ones that escalate things. Can you break those down?
Sure. Feedback loops are, well, they're central to how systems work. It's how information about the output of an action feeds back and influences the next action. Your sources focus on two main kinds.
Okay, the first being reinforcing loops.
Right. Reinforcing feedback loops, think of them as amplifiers. They accelerate change in one direction, could be growth, could be decline. They drive things further and further away from the starting point. Your sources give some pretty stark examples.
Like those legacy burdens you mentioned.
Yeah.
Racism, patriarchy.
Exactly. The source describes how these historical beliefs and structures, racism, patriarchy, but also maybe extreme individualism or materialism, they weave together to create this culture of competitive separatism. This then leads to actively marginalizing or exiling certain groups, people seen as other, which then reinforces the inequality, strengthens the justifications for the separation, and the whole thing escalates. It feeds itself.
And the success for the successful example.
Yeah, that's another classic reinforcing loop. People or groups who already have advantages, maybe wealth, access, connections, find it easier to get more advantages, more capital, better opportunities. Meanwhile, those without those initial advantages face more barriers, maybe poorer schools, discrimination making it harder and harder to catch up. The gap widens.
And the source had a warning about these.
A very direct one. It quotes the systems thinker Donella Meadows. A system with an unchecked reinforcing feedback loop ultimately will destroy itself.
Wow. Okay, so we can't just escalate forever.
Eventually something breaks. It leads to collapse if the loop isn't interrupted or balanced somehow.
Which brings us to the other type, balancing loops.
Yes, balancing or stabilizing feedback loops. These are the ones that try to keep things steady. They work to maintain homeostasis, keeping key variables within a certain healthy range.
Like biological examples.
Exactly. Your sources use examples like your body maintaining its temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or regulating blood sugar. If things drift too high or too low, balancing loops kick in to bring them back to the target level. They resist change away from a set point.
So one type pushes things further away, the other pulls things back to center.
That's the basic difference. And this is where your source introduces a really provocative idea. It draws on the Gaia hypothesis, the idea of Earth as one big self-regulating living system.
Okay.
It speculates. And it is speculation. Whether huge global crises like climate change or even pandemics like COVID-19 could be seen, from a systems perspective, as massive balancing feedback loops kicking in.
Whoa, how does that work?
The idea is that human activity, especially since the Industrial Revolution, driven by these runaway reinforcing loops of population growth, consumption, resource extraction, has pushed the whole Earth system way outside its stable homeostatic range.
So the planet is trying to correct itself.
Perhaps. The source suggests our way of living, rooted in that story of separation, might have made us deaf to earlier, gentler warning signals from the planet. So now, these much more dramatic, painful balancing mechanisms like climate disruption or disease outbreaks are emerging to try and force the overall system back towards some kind of equilibrium.
That's a really challenging way to think about it.
Yeah.
Especially given the immense human suffering involved.
Absolutely. The source doesn't minimize the suffering at all. It acknowledges the terrible cost. But it frames it as an urgent wake-up call, a plea to learn the lessons quickly to avert even worse disasters down the line. It even mentions, from biodiversity experts in your sources, how things like deforestation create these perfect storms for new diseases to jump from animals to humans. It notes there are maybe 1.7 million unidentified viruses in mammals and birds. A sobering thought.
So understanding these loops, these system dynamics, is critical for tackling these huge global challenges.
It's essential, according to your sources. We need leaders, it argues, who think in terms of systems, who see the deep interconnectedness of everything: human health, animal health, environmental health. It calls for a really dramatic paradigm shift away from separation and extraction. Our fate, it suggests, is tied up in recognizing our interbeing.
Which leads us right to that positive vision the source offers,
Yeah.
shifting from the story of separation to what it calls the story of interbeing.
Exactly. This is the fundamental shift the source is advocating for, moving how we see ourselves and the world. It's truly grasping that we're all in this together, not just as a nice slogan, but as a description of reality from a systems view.
How does that work in practice?
Well, the source talks about how when you bring apparently polarized parts together, whether that's parts inside yourself or divided groups in a family or even nations, and you help them find common ground.
Like the shared desire for safety it mentioned.
Exactly. When you find those shared core needs beneath the conflict, you start to see the interconnectedness. You realize that hurting another part of the system ultimately hurts you too, and that cooperation benefits the whole. It quotes Meadows again here. No part of the human race is separate either from other human beings or from the global ecosystem.
And the source is pretty blunt about the alternative, about not making this shift.
Very blunt. It says continuing down the path of separation, of exiling, pushing away parts of ourselves, other people, the natural world, it just leads to breakdown, system collapse, whether that looks like environmental crisis, companies failing, personal illness, or just inner chaos. Exiling is toxic to any system because it cuts off connection and flow.
So what is the core of this alternative paradigm, the foundation for interbeing?
The source proposes that fundamentally, within each person, there's a core essence. It calls it the self, a place of wisdom, compassion, calm, clarity, courage.
Okay.
And what we often experience as our problems, difficult thoughts, intense emotions, compulsive behaviors, these aren't bad parts that need to be eliminated. They are parts of us that got burdened, maybe by difficult experiences, and took on extreme roles to try and protect us.
So they're trying to help, in a way.
In their own, sometimes disruptive way, yes. And the source claims these parts can return to their natural, helpful state when they feel understood, accepted, and when the burdens they carry are released. Accessing that core self allows us to lead our inner system with compassion and live more harmoniously, recognizing our connection to everything else.
And what are the benefits the source describes of living more from that self, that inner being perspective?
It paints a pretty appealing picture. More capacity for love for yourself and others, access to deeper joy, delight. Also, the ability to feel sadness and grief fully, meaningfully, not just as raw pain. Finding purpose, engaging in habits that feel truly aligned. It suggests that while the healing work to get there can be challenging, retrieving those exiled parts, it doesn't require constant struggle or sacrifice. It's actually about finding more ease and flow.
That sounds like a pretty profound shift, especially internally. How does someone even begin to cultivate that? Did your sources offer any practical steps?
They did. There's a description of a practice, sometimes called the daily IFS meditation, which is designed specifically to help foster this internal shift, to build that relationship with your inner system from a place of self.
Okay, can you walk us through the basics of that practice as the source lays it out?
Sure. The basic idea is pretty simple. You find a few minutes, get comfortable, maybe close your eyes, take some breaths to just settle yourself. Then you turn your attention inward. You start by checking in with any inner parts, thoughts, feelings, sensations that you're already aware of. Maybe parts you know well.
Just noticing them.
More than noticing. It's about building a relationship. So you might mentally ask them, how are you doing right now? Is there anything you need? Anything more you want me to know about your experience?
Like you're genuinely talking to them.
Yeah, taking them seriously.
Oh.
The source suggests treating them with care, maybe like you would a child, letting them know you're there, you're listening, you care. And also reminding them gently about you, your core self, that calm, curious, compassionate presence that's listening.
Okay, then what?
After connecting with the parts you know, you might just gently expand your awareness. See if any other parts want some attention, maybe a feeling you usually ignore, or a thought that keeps nagging. The goal isn't to fix them, just to get to know them. Understand their job, their fears, their needs. Let them know they're not alone with it anymore.
And there was an optional step too, something about embodiment.
Right. This is interesting. You can optionally invite your parts, all of them, to just relax a little inside, to trust you, yourself, to be more present in your body.
Why would they do that?
Well, the idea is that when parts are really active or distressed, they can kind of pull your energy, make you feel scattered or contracted. If they're waiting to soften even a bit and trust your self's leadership, you might notice a real shift.
Like what?
The source says maybe more internal space, feeling calmer, more grounded, more present, maybe a sense of ease or energy or just quiet well-being. But, and this is important, if parts don't want to relax, that's okay too. You just acknowledge their hesitation. It probably means they need more time, more connection, more understanding first. No forcing.
Got it. And how do you wrap up the practice?
You just gently bring your focus back, maybe thank your parts for showing up, for sharing. And you can make a little commitment to yourself to check in again later, to continue building this inner connection.
And it's not just a formal meditation.
No, the source also suggests weaving this into your day. Just brief moments. Pause. Check in what's going on inside me right now. Notice which parts are active. Offer them a little bit of that calm self-energy. Remind them you're there. It does add a crucial note, though. This daily practice is great for building the relationship, but for deeper healing, for really unburdening parts from past pain or trauma, often more focused work, maybe with a therapist trained in this approach, is needed, especially if your inner system feels very vulnerable or overwhelmed.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey. From systems and biology all the way to our inner lives, society, the planet. It definitely brings home the source's main message, doesn't it? About shifting from seeing things as separate and needing control to seeing the connections and leading with compassion.
Absolutely. And by understanding how these systems work, how they can get stuck in problematic loops because of certain beliefs, but also how they can heal and change when those underlying paradigms shift, your sources really offer a hopeful path, moving away from fighting symptoms and towards transforming the whole system inside and out.
So here's something to think about, drawing from everything we've discussed from your sources. Given that powerful warning about unchecked reinforcing loops leading to collapse, what might be the most urgent reinforcing loop you, the listener, can identify? Maybe it's operating in your own life, your relationships, or perhaps in a larger issue you care about in the world. And how might seeing that loop through this systems lens, this lens of interconnectedness, offer a completely new perspective on how you might engage with it? Thank you so much for providing the material that made this deep dive possible today. We really hope you keep exploring these fascinating and honestly quite transformative ideas.